Pardon.
Hey, this is Eric Keller. I wanted to record some videos on how I created this project. This is an Amblypygid or Amblypygid, however you want to pronounce it, a Whipscorpion or tailless Whipscorpion, and this is it rendered in Redshift for Maya. But I want to show you how I created this model in ZBrush, and so throughout the series I'm going to show you some time lapse on how I sculpted and painted this model. We're going to talk, of course, about techniques, maybe some tips, but we'll also be talking about the biology of these wonderful animals. And they do exist in the real world. They're a real thing. I've met one, and they're quite nice, actually. The specific species is Acanthophrynis coronatus. It's a tailless whipscorpion. You can see they're big and they have long, spindly legs, which I know everybody just loves. These are pictures of it on the Encyclopedia of Life, EOL.org. So here's where I'm at right now. Most of the top blocked out. I'm still working on the mouth here. I'm definitely working on the underside. So there's parts right here that need to be fixed, and so on. If I switch over here, you can see this is the first version that I created from Zspheres. So like I do with a lot of these kind of spindly leg organisms, this is a little bit old school method. I started with a Z-sphere. I'm just going to go through the undo history, and you can sort of see I just started building out the basic framework. Now what you're not seeing here is I did have an image that I used in Spotlight as a background so that I could kind of match the overall proportions. So I am kind of tracing a reference image, but it's basically kind of a top view. And this is kind of where it ended up. Just started noodling things around and positioning them, and so on, using the Z-spheres. Old school technique, fun to watch. Let's go all the way to the beginning here. Zoink. And to use Spotlight, I'm going to bring in an image that I'm going to use for reference. So I'll go to the texture palette, choose import, find my image. You know, JPEGs usually work well, that kind of thing. So select that. I'll choose open, and then I'll go to the texture palette. I'm going to select that image and click on add to Spotlight. So this adds it to the Spotlight. Spotlight, you can see, has this interface, which is this giant dial, and I can use this dial to scale the image, rotate the image. You can see that the image is actually kind of faded here. That's because I've turned the opacity down. But if I select on this icon, you can see, let's move this off to the side here for a second. You can see that it gives the name of the function as I hover over them. So opacity, if I drag it clockwise, the opacity becomes full-on opacity. If I drag it counterclockwise, it fades out. So this is a good one to use when you're just trying to get some reference images for proportions. But what I usually do is I'll typically find a good image to use for reference for basic proportions, and I'll put that in the Spotlight and stick it on the screen so that I can just trace. So I'm going to just zoom ahead here in the timeline. Okay, so once I have my reference imagery set up, I started making a Z-sphere model. So you can just kind of see, I just built it out really quickly. It probably took maybe 10 minutes at the most, so very fast. Okay, so I converted the Z-sphere model into a mesh, and now I'm switching over to time-lapse mode. So I'm using mostly the move, smooth, and inflate brushes to shape this, and you can see that I'm going to start making polygroups here for each one of the legs here so I can start to work with them separately. And you can see I'm splitting it up into polygroups. So I just put the pedipalps as polygroups, and I'm going to do that same thing to the rest of the organism. So right now, just focusing on the proportion, giving the rough idea of the shape of this thing. Kind of takes a while to get to know them. So here I am splitting it into polygroups, and then I'm using sculptress mode to start to dial in the forms on the top. So you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, I have a picture of my reference. That's the molt that's in the frame. So I'm kind of just defining the basic shapes here. I don't want to get caught up in the detail yet. And I'm going to get a few things wrong, which I have to fix later, but it's all part of getting to know the organism. Kind of splitting up the abdomen here, these little plates on the top. And of course, it's always a good idea to count the number of plates, make sure you have the right number. By just roughing them in here with the Damien standard brush and the clay brush in the sculptress mode. And now I'm going to work on this whip part here, these long antennae-like structures that are used as feelers. You can see my reference. I have a close-up of this bend here in the corner. And these are made up of segments, which I'll dial in at a later time. But right now I just want to get the length and the shape right. So now I've got the abdomen as an individual subtool, kind of closed it off, put it in Dynamesh mode, and I'm using masking to help create these overlapping parts. Now this is something I'm going to revisit later on because I kind of got this wrong. And this is a good example of why it's always good to look at pictures of living organisms as opposed to just the molts or just dead specimens. Because it looks like these are kind of collapsed, overlapping sheets of armor. But when you look at pictures of it, of the live organism, you'll see that actually the abdomen itself is kind of like this flexible balloon, and these plates are kind of like stuck on, like armor stuck to a balloon. And the abdomen actually expands and contracts quite a bit. So I'll have to fix that later. So now we're just looking at the bottom here. When I was sculpting this, I had almost no good reference, just a few images. So this part I needed to fix later on once I got better reference of the bottom of it, but it still had to sculpt something. So I'm just kind of roughing it in as best I can. So this is where the legs are going to come out of the bottom of the cephalothorax. Now I'm working on my favorite part, which is the pedipalps, so these long, crazy, spiky arms. You can see in the bottom left, there's one of my reference images. And I've they look like balloon animals right now, but the meshes have been separated into polygroups using, and you can see indicated by the colors. And I didn't split these into subtools. I kept it as the same subtool, but I did split it into symmetrical polygroups. And I'm using mask by polygroups so that I can work on each individual part without disturbing its neighbor, which is a great way to work. So now these little grizzly pincher things at the bottom were a lot of fun to sculpt. So I'm kind of roughing those in right now. And I'll show you a bit of reference in a second. These things, largely in the wild, they eat moths, they eat lizards. Some species even pluck shrimp out of streams and stuff. When they're reared in captivity, and believe it or not, these guys make great pets. When they're reared in captivity, they're often fed crickets. They're not venomous and they're completely harmless to people, in spite of the fact that they look like a nightmare. The worst you could get is like a little prick from accidentally touching one of the little spiky bits. But they are completely harmless, and a lot of people really enjoy rearing them as pets. I'm going to stick to dogs myself because I'm better with dogs. But you can see I'm just refining the forms and just kind of, there you can see a close-up. So I'm trying to match that. I also, look at these things under a stereoscopic microscope just to kind of understand the three-dimensional shapes a little bit better. Of course, this one, all the pictures you're seeing are from a molt that's within a frame, so I couldn't really move around too much. But it's kind of cool. They look like weird little spiky hands. And you can see in the time lapse, okay, the view's getting a little bit crazy there as I'm rotating around. But I'm using the Damien Standard brush to kind of start to define the shape a little bit more. And I was using the snake hook brush to kind of pull out those spikes. So now I'm refining this part. Again, sort of hiding and showing and masking different parts so I can get the kind of the connection there, that joint area between the very end of it and this sort of forearm kind of bit. It almost looks like a wrist in a way. So that I'm still working on refining. Again, it takes a lot of staring at reference to really understand how that part of the organism works. Pulled out some spikes there, and I'm using sculptor's mode and the snake hook brush to kind of pull out these spikes. And it takes a while to kind of really get the quality, the character of the spikes, because every type of spike on an arachnid or an insect has its own kind of flavor or quality or personality to it. You don't want to just pull out something willy-nilly. You want to kind of like really figure out how does it taper, where is it thickest, how does it bend, and that takes a lot of fooling around. You also notice from the reference image that there are different kinds of spikes. There are long curved ones, there's sort of medium length ones, and then there's very short stubby ones. And I had to use the bigger spikes as landmarks while I'm sculpting, because it kind of gets easy to get lost with all the different spikes on these things. So I pulled out the big ones first, to use them as kind of landmarks and guides to kind of figure out where to put the smaller ones. And of course, again, spent a lot of time counting the number of spikes and trying to get the distance between them correct. And that's kind of the fun challenge of this thing. So now I'm kind of pulling out the smaller spikes, again using the snake hook brush in sculptress mode, which is convenient because it allows you to add geometry with each brush stroke. So sometimes I'll use Dynamesh, sometimes I'll use Sculptress, sometimes I'll use Sculptress mode, I should say, within ZBrush, and sometimes I use a combination of it. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around Sculptress mode, since I've been using Dynamesh for so long, that kind of workflow, I'm more used to that. But the only way to learn the new tools is to use them and see how they fit into your own workflow. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. So I'm really kind of fussing over these spikes a lot, and I'll probably revisit them again and again just to make sure that I have them in the right place and that they have the right quality. The position, the length, the number of spikes, that's how you tell, often how you tell the different species apart. There are a number of species of Amblypygid. There's not just one. But you know, this part is what I really enjoy, is just kind of sorting out the shape of these parts. Now I'm kind of using the Damien standard brush to kind of dial in some of these different, you know, areas, these ridges that are pulled out from the surface. They kind of give kind of an elegant swoop to the whole thing. And you know, that of course takes some practice to figure out where they actually fit, and I probably changed it 2 or 3 times just to make sure it's right. I am trying to be as much of a stickler for accuracy as possible, because to me that's the whole point of the challenge. It's very easy to make up spiky monsters out of the top of your head once you understand how ZBrush works. To me, a much more interesting challenge is to use ZBrush as a tool to understand living organisms that actually work, that actually exist in the world, and that's kind of the whole point of this exercise. So to that end, I'm really spending a lot of time getting the spikes right, and I hope I did. There's a few people that I know that could probably look at this and tell me what I got right and what I got wrong, and it's kind of scary to know that there are people that nerdy out there in the world. In this chapter, I'm going to talk about how I blocked out or started this part of the model right here that you see. This is obviously much later on, after I've created a lot of detail and color and so on, but this video just shows how I sort of started blocking it out. Also, I wanted to give a quick shout out to my friend Gil, who's got a great website. This is where I ordered my own molt, which I'm using for reference, so it already came framed, but he's got some great pictures of this organism on his website, and a lot of other great pictures of other organisms. So he's a great photographer, very informed and interesting biologist. So check him out. So let's take a look at that block out for that section of the model. Okay, so I've separated the bottom of the cephalothorax. This is the mouth and the part where the legs come out from underneath the body. And it's its own subtool, it's its own mesh. I'm using Dynamesh for those of you who are ZBrush users. As I sculpt on this, so I'm treating it just like a blob of clay. And I'm using the Damien standard brush, the move brush to move parts around, smooth, and the H polish brush, and just kind of dialing in the different parts of this surface. I'm going to keep this as one single surface, it doesn't need to be separated. This, I believe, is the book lungs. That's what it looks like, or it reminds me of the opening for book lungs on the bottom of spiders. And then there's some other details here. I'm not exactly sure what their function is. It's something I need to look up for sure. But I'm using the Damien standard brush to kind of just carve in these sort of separation lines here that I see when I'm looking at my reference photography. And then creating a space for where the legs come out. There's that long spiky thing just below the mouth, which looks terrifying. I'm not exactly sure of its function, but I'm assuming that it's being used to pin prey while it feeds it into its mouth. Kind of terrifying, but kind of neat too. So that's the bottom of the cephalothorax. I'm going to have a time lapse that shows how I used the ZModeler brush to do a retopology of this part of the model. So this is the top of the cephalothorax. So in the previous video we worked on the bottom. So this is the top. And it's been about a year since I started working on this model. Got wrapped up in other stuff, so I'm just coming back to it now. So I wanted to take advantage of the new ZModeler extrude edge function so that I could create a new topology. So this is kind of what the old topology looks like. It's a typical Dynamesh. If I zoom in, you can see it's made up of lots of itty bitty polygons and a few triangles. And it's not really, it doesn't have any kind of edge flow, so that makes it difficult to work with. But it's typically, my workflow involves sculpting using this type of Dynamesh topology until I get up to a certain level of detail, maybe like this level of detail. And at this point, I'm like, okay, now I want to do a retopology, which will make it easier to create UVs, make it easier to rig if I want to animate it, and also I can take advantage of subdivisions and so on. So this is sort of the before, and then this is the after. So you can see now I have a topology that follows the edge flow of the surface. And then essentially once I had finished this topology, I subdivided the model. So I projected the detail from the other version of the model onto this version of the model. And then I did some further refinements, added even more detail, some surface noise. And I also flattened it quite a bit because I did have a comment from an arachnologist that my previous version of the model was a little bit too tall. These things need to be really, really flat so that they can squirm in between layers of bark on a tree or within a cave or that kind of thing. So flatten this guy out quite a bit. So let's take a look at the time lapse of how I did the retopology in ZBrush. And we're off, starting with a plane in the middle of the model with the subdivision down the center. I have symmetry turned on. I'm using the ZModeler brush to extrude the edge so that it snaps as I extrude each new polygon and follows along the surface. So it's kind of just a big game of connect the dots. And I'm creating this polygon mesh, this netting, so that the edges flow along the surface, and especially in those areas where you have deep crevices or bulges or separating lines. I really want to make sure that I outline those with edges as much as possible, and also have a polygon around that eye spot, which I'll create an inset for later. So it's all about edge flow. It's all about following the contour of the surface so that when I do a projection, it's a nice, neat kind of shrink wrap. And this will also make it nice when I create displacement maps, when I finally render this. That edge flow will also make it nice to bring out those details. So it's fairly low polygon, the end result is. Okay, so I've created a single-sided surface, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude that surface. So you can see this green and yellow part, that's an extrusion based on that original single-sided mesh, which is a huge time saver because what it allows me to do is create thickness to the model. Now I'm just using the move and smooth brushes to kind of push it out to the edges so that it matches the contours of that transparent subtool, the original Dynamesh version of the model. And so just trying to match it as best as possible, creating insets around those eye spots so that I'll have more geometry as well as edge loops to bring out that detail. And then just doing a little bit of refinement. Now I'm going to start creating these spikes along the perimeter. So first I tried extruding parts for the little spiky bits. That didn't really work. So what I ended up doing is creating a poly loop that goes all around the edge of the surface. And I subdivided it, masked off most of it except for that pink poly loop. Now you can see I'm using the move brush to kind of drag those pink polygons, that poly group, to match the spikes that come out of my original Dynamesh surface. So that, again, just maintaining that edge flow around the perimeter. You can see my reference imagery. I stuck that in there so you can see what I'm trying to work on. Now that I have that sort of pink poly loop matching the position of those spikes, I'm going to subdivide and project and then just pull out the spike geometry. The main advantage of using that pink poly loop that goes around the perimeter is it's very easy to add additional edge loops if I need more geometry to support all that detail. So that's kind of how I did the spikes and the retopo. Now I'm just doing a bit of refinement. And then I'm working on the bottom of the cephalothorax. So you can see in the semi-transparent is my original Dynamesh surface, these white polygons that you see appearing. That's the retopo that I'm doing with the ZModeler brush, and I'm inserting edges and filling in gaps using the fill tool to kind of create this cage. In this part of the video I have the original surface hidden, but it's still there. But I'm just kind of, again, this all connect the dots, just making the bottom of this, and then I'm going to extrude it and connect the top and the bottom, and then create some polygons around the perimeter. And I've subdivided it and used projection. So you can see now it's conforming to that original shape. That's because it's projecting to that hidden subtool, my original version of the surface. So now I have an edge flow that flows along the surface better. And I'm creating that little spiky thing below the mouth using an extrusion, subdividing and refining. And then I'm selecting these polygons at the end of each of these openings, creating an inset so that I have an edge loop around those openings. Again, that will help the edge flow and make it easier for me to bring out those details. I apologize that this part of the video is making you nauseous. It's a little rocking back and forth. Then I'm subdividing and just doing a bit more refinement, masking off that spike thing so that I can start creating some details. So that's basically how I did a retopology for the cephalothorax. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to Bloopertone. Also hit the notifications bell so you see every time I post a new video. I'll be talking a lot more about my CG projects, and of course, there will always be lots of bugs to talk about.
Bloop, don't.